December 26th, 1943, Boxing Day, and deep in the Barents Sea icy blackness, even darker shapes move through the night. The mighty British battleship Duke of York is sailing with a mixed force of cruisers and destroyers to meet a deadly foe in combat. Her commander has carefully set a trap, and now he steams his ship onward through the driving wind and heaving seas, hoping to catch a glimpse of his prey. All on board are tense as the moment draws near. Any second now, the enemy should come into view. Duke of York fires a star shell high into the air to illuminate the surroundings and see through the impenetrable blackness. And there, the light reveals it. The German battleship, Scharnhorst. For hours now, Scharnhorst has played a deadly game of cat and mouse, hunting a convoy of vulnerable Allied merchant ships and dodging the warships of the Royal Navy. But now, she's been caught. The German battleship is forced to make a stand. Her guns traverse, and the dark night erupts into flame. In her time, Scharnhorst was one of the most feared battleships on the North Atlantic. Together with her sister Gneisenau, she hunted Allied shipping and inflicted a terrible toll. Putting Scharnhorst out of commission became one of the principal goals of the Royal Navy's surface fleet. After careful planning and a turn of good fortune, the British enacted a scheme to lure Scharnhorst into the open ocean once and for all. The stage was set for one of the most brutal engagements in the battle for Europe's oceans. It would leave the pride of the German fleet a flaming wreck, with only 36 bedraggled survivors. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Ocean Liner Designs, and this is the story of the Scharnhorst, the German Navy's lucky ship. This is Wilhelmshaven, Germany, today the nation's primary military port. It has centuries of proud military tradition because it is Germany's only deep-water port. But while today ships only dock here, 80 years ago, they were actually built here. What today stands as an arsenal for the Bundesmarine, Germany's modern-day navy, was once a shipyard, which had once constructed military vessels since the 1870s. In 1935, the keel plates had been laid for a special ship, a class leader of a new generation of German battleship. She was named for a Prussian general killed in the Napoleonic Wars, and the vessel would go on to become one of the most feared hunters of the North Atlantic Ocean. She was called Scharnhorst. Born out of Germany's ambition to rebuild its naval prowess after World War I, the Treaty of Versailles had imposed stringent restrictions on the post-war German navy. Not only was its personnel limited to just 15,000 across all roles, but ships' displacement were also restricted to 10,000 tons, with a gun caliber cap at 11 inches or 280 millimeters. In the late 1920s, Germany strategically designed the Deutschland class, a trio of capital ships that aimed to maximize on the stipulations of the treaty. And though officially listed as displacing 10,000 tons, these ships in reality exceeded the treaty specifications by nearly 50%. They were equipped with 6 powerful 11-inch main guns, but they emerged as a hybrid class, technically heavy cruisers, but colloquially known in the English-speaking world as pocket battleships, because their battleship-grade armament was mounted on a cruiser-sized frame. It was the shot heard around the world. The inception of the Deutschland class ignited a fierce European naval arms race. Learning of the German plans, the French initiated the construction of 2 13-inch armed fast battleships as a counter, and then Germany had to answer back. By 1933, the Kriegsmarine, Germany's navy, began envisioning a superior class of fast battleship of their own. The result was a pair of well-equipped hunters. Scharnhorst and her sister Gneisenau originally would have been completely illegal. Their size, a massive displacement of 32,000 tons, flew well in the face of the Treaty of Versailles. But then, in 1935, everything changed. Hitler had signed an agreement with the British known as the Anglo-German Naval Agreement. The accord allowed Germany a naval tonnage up to 35% that of Britain's, with individual battleships not surpassing now 35,000 tons. The agreement legitimised the construction of Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, but the British weren't to know that the formal ordering process had begun already a year earlier. Scharnhorst was Germany's debut in the fast battleship category, and for that task she was well equipped. Her main armament featured 3 huge turrets, each fitted with triple upgraded 11-inch or 280mm guns. The caliber was an interesting one. As far as battleships went, it was relatively small and not much bigger than those found on heavy cruisers. Opting for these guns ensured construction remained on schedule. The 1935 treaty meant Hitler could have ordered them to be upgunned, but it would have delayed the sisters' introductions as larger guns were being built. Scharnhorst also employed lessons taken from the earlier Deutschland class. While forward-thinking, the diesel engines of the Deutschland class had been problematic thanks to teething troubles. Scharnhorst employed the more trusted high-pressure steam turbine plant, combining the benefits of weight saving and reliability. The ship was launched in October 1936 and commissioned just over 2 years later. Her dimensions were nothing short of impressive. Steaming out for her first sea trials, she must have been a proud sight for the workers of Wilhelmshaven. Scharnhorst spanned a length of 771 feet or 235 metres, with a beam of 98 feet or 30 metres, and a full load displacement surpassing 37,000 tonnes. This was the new generation of warship Germany had been looking for. During the spring and early summer of 1939, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau underwent a rigorous period of training and working up, but by June, tests unveiled several issues with the ships. The most serious was their tendency to take on water. They had been designed with a low, slim silhouette. It made them difficult targets, but it meant that the forward end would often be half submerged in the ocean. The bows had been straight-stemmed and squat. They were totally reshaped with a clipper-style curve and a sharp upwards flare. And then the anchors were moved to sit on top of the deck, but it still wouldn't totally fix the issue. For the rest of the ship's careers, in conditions even slightly choppier than a calm sea, the forward turrets of both vessels frequently got drenched, and they were often trained aftward or pointed backwards in a futile attempt to avoid the onslaught of water. Despite these slight issues, the ships were a huge boost to Germany's relatively small surface fleet. Their introduction to service couldn't have been better timed. The modifications were finished, and the ships were ready just 2 months after the Nazi war machine commenced its assault on Poland. Britain, France, and their allies stood against them. The costliest conflict in modern history had begun, and Scharnhorst would go immediately to war. But the steel Leviathan would need an equally steely commander if she would ever do any damage to the enemy, but fortunately, the German Navy had just the right man. Scharnhorst's first commander had been beloved by the crew. Otto Celiax deeply respected his ship and her crew, and they respected him back. But the demands of the war effort needed him elsewhere, and he'd been promoted to Rear Admiral. It left a vacancy for the right man to step in and assume command of the ship on her maiden wartime sortie. And in late September 1939, a confident figure strode onto the ship's decks for the first time. He was a veteran of the sea, an old hand who had started out way back in 1912 as a midshipman and climbed the ranks through the years of hard service. He had big shoes to fill, but if anyone could do it, it was him. His name was Kurt Caesar Hoffmann. Transitioning from the leadership of a revered figure like Celiax might have been challenging for many, but Hoffmann rose to the occasion. While there were initial reservations among the crew about how Hoffmann would compare to Celiax, his strong leadership skills, dedication to duty, and genuine concern for his crew quickly won them over. Hoffmann not only managed to uphold the standards set by Celiax, but also carved out his own esteemed place within the ranks of the Scharnhorst's crew. He would oversee 56 officers and over 1,600 ratings, engineers, Gunners, cooks, sailors, they all combined to turn Scharnhorst from an impressive engineering achievement into a living, breathing thing, a floating town, and a terrifying weapon, all in one. They set out for the first time in November 1939 with orders to slip through the British blockade and into the North Atlantic, where they could hunt with virtual impunity. Scharnhorst and Gneisenau slipped out of Wilhelmshaven on November 21, 1939, with a simple goal. Their fleet mate, Admiral Graf Spee, was being hunted in the South Atlantic. The pair of newer German ships would slip through the British blockade and out into the North Atlantic Ocean. News of their escape would draw British units out and ease the pressure on Graf Spee. The pair made steam, and Hoffmann knew it was a dangerous exercise. One wrong move could put them on a course to meet the formidable Royal Navy's home fleet head-on. For all their strengths, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau would be hopelessly outgunned by the larger warships of the Royal Navy. Their strength lay in their speed and the danger they posed to Allied merchant shipping. It would force the Royal Navy to take them seriously as a threat, but make them incredibly difficult to catch. As they sailed for the first time for the open ocean, Hoffmann and his crew couldn't have known that they would blood their guns much sooner than they expected. That first day, steaming between Iceland and the Faroe Islands, they chanced upon a British vessel. It was the armed merchant cruiser Rawalpindi, a glorified passenger liner fitted with 6-inch deck guns from the First World War. She didn't stand a chance. On Scharnhorst Bridge, Hoffmann hoped to capture the ship and give her crew a chance at life. The Germans flashed a series of warnings, ordering Rawalpindi to stop and be abandoned, but to their surprise, the British vessel turned and faced them. The captain, Edward Kennedy, had decided to stand and fight. Despite Rawalpindi's valiant resistance, she stood little chance against the German powerhouses. Within 40 minutes, the duo had obliterated Rawalpindi, who, to her credit, had managed to actually score a single hit on Scharnhorst, which did little to no damage. Scharnhorst's guns had been blooded, but it had been an inglorious victory. Hoffmann ordered his ship stopped to retrieve survivors, but the approach of a British warship raised an alarm. It was the approach of the British Home Fleet. Alerted to Rawalpindi's calls for help, a leading force of cruisers had arrived on station to tail the German ships until the main force could catch up, hunt them down, and destroy them. Hoffmann sensed the danger, but fortune was on his side. A rain squall blew in and covered Scharnhorst and Gneisenau as they made full steam for cover. The British forces just couldn't hope to catch them, and the Germans had escaped. But the inclement weather proved just as damaging to the Germans as it had to the British. In the North Sea, the sister ships encountered seas so heavy they both took on damage and had to steam home for repairs. During the chilly winter of 1939 to 1940, Scharnhorst remained mostly dormant, undergoing maintenance and overhaul, but by April the next year, she, alongside most of the Kriegsmarine's surface fleet, was mobilised to support the occupation of Norway and Denmark in Operation Weserübung. Under the command of Admiral Gunther Lütjens, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau were designated to provide distant cover for the landings. They were accompanied by the heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper and 13 destroyers, 9 of which were transporting troops for Narvik in the North Sea. The British Royal Navy quickly detected this formidable German force, prompting the Home Fleet to intercept. On April 9th, after a skirmish with Admiral Hipper, the British battlecruiser HMS Renown engaged Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. For 90 minutes, the ships exchanged fire in challenging weather, resulting in minor damage on both sides. With Scharnhorst experiencing turbine problems, though, the Germans disengaged, returning to Wilhelmshaven that evening. In June 1940, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau were hunting together again, steaming off the coast of Norway, when they suddenly encountered an unexpected force. The British aircraft carrier HMS Glorious was steaming with 2 destroyer escorts, Ardent and a Castor. This would prove a devastating engagement for the British and serve as a good demonstration of what these 2 ferocious German warships were actually capable of. Ardent rushed to cover Glorious with a smoke screen, fire torpedoes and pour supporting gunfire onto the German ships. She even managed to hit Scharnhorst with a shell, but it simply bounced off the ship's thick armour. The Germans' 11-inch guns fired back, and the effect was devastating. Ardent was shattered by gunfire that left her dead in the water before she sank with only 2 survivors. Scharnhorst then trained her guns on Glorious and got to work. Just an hour and a half later, the carrier was blazing from stem to stern, listing in the water, and she finally sank. Acasta had tried to maintain a smokescreen with some decent effect, but now she was the only British ship left with nowhere to run. The combined firepower of Scharnhorst and Gneisenau reduced her to scrap metal, and she sank soon after, but not without biting back. Acasta had fired a volley of torpedoes, which nearly all missed, but one. It slammed home into Scharnhorst and exploded, badly damaging her. From the engagement, only 40 British sailors survived, and it proved a devastating embarrassment for the Royal Navy. Years later, it would come to light that the codebreakers at Bletchley Park had intercepted German messages and learned that Scharnhorst and Gneisenau had broken out for the open ocean, but their warnings weren't taken seriously because they were mostly civilians, and Glorious was never notified. For Hoffmann and his men, it was a resounding victory, but their ship had been nearly crippled by the torpedo. They limped for home, and a hero's welcome. Despite the torpedo hit, Scharnhorst had inflicted a terrible toll on the British and had begun to earn a reputation as the Kriegsmarine's lucky ship. The next summer, the 2 sister ships, repaired and refreshed, were ready to break out into the open ocean once again as part of Operation Berlin. Once more under Admiral Lütjen's command, the 2 ships could now, at last, focus on hunting down Allied merchant ships and show what they were truly capable of. From January 22nd to March 22nd, 1941, the sister ships wreaked havoc in the Atlantic, sinking or capturing 22 merchant vessels totaling over 115,000 tons. Their presence heavily disrupted the vital Allied convoy system, but despite their strength, they consistently avoided engagements with British battleships, with Lütjens opting for caution and disengaging on 3 distinct occasions. By late March, both vessels reached the safety of Brest in occupied France, docking on the 23rd under cover provided by the German Air Force. But being stationed in Brest posed significant challenges. Over the subsequent months, the British launched a lot of attacks attempting to neutralise the German battleships docked there. In June 1941, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau were joined by the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen, which had docked after her ill-fated mission accompanying the German battleship Bismarck. To ensure the ship's safety and get them within range of defending against a possible British attack on Norway, it was decided to relocate them all to Germany. But this would be no easy task. They would need to sail right under the noses of the British through the English Channel. In February 1942, during what the Germans termed Operation Cerberus, but what has since been called the Channel Dash, all 3 vessels daringly navigated through the English Channel. Despite sustaining some minor damages, they successfully reached Germany. And for the Germans, it was a triumph, but for the British it was another monumental embarrassment. This audacious move led to public outrage in Britain, especially given that these ships had been operating so close to British shores. Prime Minister Winston Churchill ordered an inquiry, but in some ways, for the British, it was a blessing in disguise, because once back in German waters, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau's threat to the Atlantic convoys had diminished significantly. Soon after docking in Kiel that same month, Gneisenau suffered heavy damage from British bombers, and though there were plans to repair her, she was relocated to occupied Poland in April, never to sail again, and Scharnhorst was on her own. By 1942, the crew of the Scharnhorst had formed a strong bond. They viewed their ship as lucky, a kind of talisman, adopting the personal mantra, Scharnhorst immer voran, Scharnhorst ever onwards. During this period, Captain Hoffmann's reputation soared amongst the crew, but it also made him a target for promotion. In the spring, it finally happened. He became a rear admiral and had to leave his beloved ship. For Scharnhorst's men it was a blow, but they could only hope his replacement would be as good a fit. But sadly for them, it wasn't to be. Kapitän zur See Friedrich Hufmeier became the warship's skipper, but in contrast to Hoffmann, he was viewed very critically by the crew. His tenure was marred by several mishaps. Once, he ran Scharnhorst aground at a blistering 26 knots, later entangled a buoy wire around a ship's shaft, and even collided with the submarine U-523 during a training exercise in August 1942. Each incident had resulted in extensive repairs. By the end of the year, with British and American air power growing in its strength and danger, Scharnhorst received orders to make for Norway and the cover of the fjords. After multiple attempts to break out, Scharnhorst finally docked on March 14, 1943. Alongside the newcomers, Norway already sheltered the formidable battleship Tirpitz, Bismarck's sister ship, as well as a selection of cruisers and destroyers, all moored in the face of Allied air assaults and fuel shortages. Docked in Kjorfjord, Scharnhorst was moored close to Tirpitz, but the camaraderie between the two crews was non-existent. Scharnhorst's seasoned crew perceived the inexperienced sailors of the Tirpitz as novices, and the latter, despite being the flagship, was deemed the unproven vessel. On top of that, Tirpitz's captain, Hans Karl Meyer, was known for his strict discipline. It earned him little respect from both crews, and many viewed him as a subpar sailor and overly authoritarian. Despite tensions with the flagship, morale aboard Scharnhorst stayed relatively good. But as summer progressed, a sense of isolation began to rise. The region's tepid days and melting ice gave way to muddy terrain, and the persistent sunlight fostered swarms of biting insects. News, both from home and the front lines, became scant. The crew's weariness grew, made only worse by the absence of nearby entertainment. The closest town was a trek of over 3 miles, or about 5 kilometers away. Inevitably, boredom began to take hold. To counter the tedium, the crew found diversions. Illegal gambling was widespread, and many sailors honed their skiing skills. The limited movie collection on the ship's projectors got some work out, and the library, filled with adventure tales, was always a popular destination. And then finally, in September 1943, a brief operation provided some relief. Scharnhorst, Tirpitz, and a group of destroyers would attack Allied shore facilities on Spitsbergen Island. They shelled it, but they quickly realised the station only housed a modest group of British and Norwegian meteorologists and a tiny military detachment. The operation had been designed as a swift propaganda victory. The combined weight of the ship's artillery had absolutely devastated the island, and medals were quickly handed out, but Scharnhorst's crew were outraged to find out that Tirpitz's crew received nearly 400 Iron Crosses, in contrast to their 160. In September 1943, Tirpitz was attacked by British midget submarines, which heavily damaged the huge battleship. Scharnhorst had still been moored nearby, but British efforts to attack her had failed, and she remained unscathed. With the heavy cruiser Lutzow having returned home to Germany, this left Scharnhorst as the last remaining operational heavy German unit stationed in Norway. Scharnhorst's crew didn't know it yet, but events would soon transpire that would see their monotonous routine interrupted for good. In November 1943, the Arctic convoys recommenced. The British had decided to operate one convoy a month to the Soviet Union from November 1943 until February the next year, and each convoy would consist of approximately 35 ships. As the German forces faced setbacks on multiple fronts, the pressure intensified for the Kriegsmarine to provide assistance. However, fuel shortages, the absence of Air Force support, and the persistent Arctic darkness hindered German efforts significantly. With Tirpitz damaged in September and sidelined, the onus of disturbing the Arctic convoys fell solely upon Scharnhorst and a handful of destroyers. It was a huge task, but which ship could be more adept than the Kriegsmarine's own lucky ship? Aboard, spirits were high. She'd received a new captain. Fritz Hintze had been fascinated by the sea since he was a child. In 1920, he had rushed to join the reformed German Navy and rose quickly through the ranks. Assuming command of Scharnhorst was, for him, the culmination of a childhood dream. Hintze had odd tendencies, including staying in bed until well past 10 o'clock in the morning every day, and also requiring a nap between 1 and 3 p.m. The crew was forbidden from even walking near his cabin while the captain had his afternoon nap. However, as odd as he was to the crew of Scharnhorst, and while never reaching the status of their favourite captain Hoffmann, Hintze went a long way to restore morale on board after the poor leadership of Hofmeier. For the upcoming operation, though, a vice admiral was needed to take command of the entire task force of battleship and destroyers. The natural choice would be Oskar Kummetz from Tirpitz, but he had returned to Germany on sick leave after his flagship was put out of action. Konteradmiral Erich Bay stepped in to take the reins. Born in Hamburg, Bay entered the German Navy in 1916 and served aboard various torpedo boats and destroyers. Over the years, his naval career saw him attain the rank of Fregattenkapitän, the middle officer's rank among senior officers of the German Navy, by the onset of World War II. Bay had quickly made a name for himself. When April 1940 had arrived, marking the German invasion of Norway, he was entrusted with leading the 4th Destroyer Flotilla, and on both the 10th and 13th of that month, he fearlessly led that flotilla against the mighty Royal Navy, including the fearsome battleship HMS Warspite. And despite their valour, the Germans suffered significant casualties, including the loss of Bay's commanding officer. But recognising Bay's exceptional valour and leadership, he was honoured with the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross in May 1940. The subsequent day heralded his promotion to full captain, replacing his fallen former commander at the helm of the German destroyer force. By February 1942, Bay once again demonstrated his strategic talent, leading the destroyer screen that was part of Operation Cerberus, the Channel Dash. Bay was promoted to Konteradmiral, or Rear Admiral, on the 1st of March 1943. He was a capable leader, but now, replacing Rear Admiral Oskar Kummetz to oversee Scharnhorst and the destroyer force in intercepting the Arctic convoys, he faced a daunting challenge. Bay was undeniably a skilled admiral, but the situation was far from ideal for his expertise. Nevertheless, the German force began to prepare for their mission. This would be a different world to the good old days back in 1939 through 1940. Now, the Germans were the underdog in the battle for the Atlantic and the Arctic. Scharnhorst's men were keen to prove that the German Navy was not yet defeated, but most of them would lose their lives trying to do it. In their preparations for the intricate dance of protecting the Arctic convoys, the British now held a considerable edge. Over 6 months of planning, coupled with invaluable insights from Ultra, the covert British code-breaking operations at Bletchley Park, which by now were taken extremely seriously by the Admiralty, ensured that the British were constantly one step ahead. The intelligence allowed them to preempt the movements of Scharnhorst, and when considering the superior radar technology of the British fleet, Scharnhorst faced an extremely daunting task for whenever she would venture from her fjord refuge in Norway. The German force would be under the keen leadership of Erich Bay. He'd lead his small but dangerous group in hunting Allied merchant ships. Fending him off was a task assigned to a veteran British commander, Admiral Bruce Fraser. His naval journey had begun way back in 1902 at Dartmouth. His ascent through the ranks had been rapid, with a specialisation in naval gunnery. He served during World War I and even had a notable role during the Dardanelles operation. And although training commitments caused him to miss the Battle of Jutland, his expertise in naval gunnery had made waves. And by 1938, Fraser had achieved flag rank and demonstrated his strategic capabilities as the Commander-in-Chief of the Home Fleet during World War II. He distinguished himself as a strategic thinker, particularly favouring radar-directed gunnery, a tactic especially effective during the pitch darkness of the polar nights and amidst the blinding Arctic snow squalls. And while Admiral Bay was a respected leader in his own right, Fraser had the advantage of a competent staff and was better positioned with the experience to handle larger warships and battle groups. His flagship was a monster. HMS Duke of York, a King George V class battleship commissioned in November 1941, she was equipped with 10 14-inch, 356mm guns and boasted a full load displacement of over 42,000 tons. Duke of York was well suited to challenge Scharnhorst, and not just because she was bigger and newer, crucially she was capable of firing her guns using radar guidance. The British Home Fleet's advanced radar systems brought Bruce and his men a significant edge. Her gun batteries were also enhanced with dedicated fire control radars, enabling accurate fire even beyond the visible horizon. Impressively, her Type 273 radar could detect targets nearly 25 nautical miles away. Duke of York could see the Germans coming and hit them accurately and reliably in full darkness. But that wasn't all. The other British vessels, such as cruisers and the majority of their destroyers, were equipped with radar technology superior to that of the Scharnhorst as well. The Germans would be up against a dangerous foe. But battleships and cruisers of the British fleet didn't directly escort the convoys. This role was designated to smaller vessels like destroyers and corvettes. However, in the event of any German surface units threatening the Arctic convoys, the most formidable British ships from their northern bases could swiftly intercept. They stood ready to offer distant protection to the convoy as circumstances demanded, ready and waiting. Soon, they'd get their chance. Given the reactivation of the Arctic convoys, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz sought Hitler's permission to deploy Scharnhorst against the next convoy navigating the Barents Sea. Because a few convoys had already crossed northern Norway without interference, the Germans felt compelled to take action. The tides of war were turning badly against Nazi Germany. The nation had already felt defeat, first in the skies over Britain, then in North Africa, and even more dangerously in Russia. Now, in 1943, Allied bombers were smashing the German homeland day and night. The German people needed victories, and attacking vulnerable convoys had always been an easy propaganda win. In deliberations with Admiral Otto Schneewind, the leader of Group North, responsible for Kriegsmarine operations in Norway, it became clear that inaction would invite Hitler's ire. Despite Schneewind's reservations about the situation, he and Dönitz agreed that a response was necessary. On December 22, 1943, a German aircraft on a routine weather observation flight chanced upon a massive outbound convoy heading to the Soviet Union, approximately 350 miles, or 563 kilometers west of Narvik. Armed with this information, Bay assembled a force that included Scharnhorst, 5 destroyers and a wolf pack of 6 U-boats led by Captain Rudolf Peters, stationed in Narvik. The U-boats would attempt to form a line along the predicted route of the convoy and intercept. The British would be sailing into a trap with deadly hunters stalking them both above and below the surface. The German target was convoy JW-55B, travelling from Loch Ewe in Scotland to Kola Inlet in the Soviet Union. The convoy was escorted by various Allied warships, and while they were adequately equipped to handle the familiar old U-boat threats, it was totally vulnerable to an assault by a warship like Scharnhorst. JW-55B was actually the second half of a much larger convoy, which moved further ahead. The first half of the convoy, JW-55A, had sailed earlier and was arriving in the Soviet Union, as 55B was to pass the danger area posed by the German warships. Dönitz gave the go-ahead. It would be called Operation Ostfront, Operation Eastern Front, and he sent this cable to Bay. A critical enemy convoy delivering supplies to the Russians poses a further threat to our valiant forces on the Eastern Front. It's imperative we intervene. Engage the convoy with Scharnhorst and accompanying destroyers. Utilize tactical prowess and exhibit audacity. Do not abandon the battle prematurely. Commit fully to the mission. Scharnhorst's superior firepower is your paramount advantage, and her role is crucial. Position the destroyers as deemed necessary, withdraw if the situation warrants it, and retreat immediately upon encountering superior enemy forces. Brief your crews on this strategy. My confidence in your capabilities is unwavering. Hail and victory, Dönitz, Grand Admiral. But the grand pretensions did not come as welcome news to Rear Admiral Bay. He, along with his predecessor, Vice Admiral Kumetz, believed that success hinged on waiting for the repair of the Tirpitz if they ever intended to deploy Scharnhorst. The track record of solo battleships was more than discouraging. Bismarck had been sunk in 1941 after a similar attempted operation. Bay proposed using only destroyers for greater flexibility, arguing that the inclusion of Scharnhorst would demand several destroyers as a protective screen, reducing those available for direct convoy engagement. But Admiral Schneewind saw things differently and maintained that Scharnhorst had to take part in the operation. Bay's apprehensions didn't come from nowhere. For one thing, the radar capabilities of Scharnhorst were notably inferior to those of the British, constraining its effectiveness to the brief twilight hours, which were merely a few around noon during the Arctic winter. By December 1943, Scharnhorst was equipped with the FUMO-26 radar, which had a range of 12 to 15 nautical miles, that's around 20 to 25 kilometers. But unfortunately, this radar wasn't suitable for blind firing of her main guns. It often proved unreliable, especially in challenging weather conditions, which were typical of the Arctic winter. Crucially though, to even stand a chance at success, Bay needed timely intelligence regarding the location and the British fleet's positioning. However, this was unlikely thanks to communication disconnects between him, the U-boat command, and the Luftwaffe based in Norway. Bay had no choice. He had his orders, and his ship would set to sea. But even as preparations were being made, keen eyes ashore noticed the activity and logged it. Upon receiving intelligence from the Norwegian resistance about Scharnhorst's potential sortie, Admiral Fraser began to formulate a plan. With a numerically and technologically superior fleet, he was suddenly presented with a unique opportunity. Scharnhorst would be drawn to the convoy like a moth to a flame, and if Fraser played his cards just right, he could destroy her. His timing was crucial, and with precise information from Ultra code-breaking about Scharnhorst's departure from Norway, Fraser intended to perfectly position his forces. The British naval strength was divided into 3 distinct units. Force 1, the cruiser force, headed by Vice Admiral Robert Burnett, comprised the light cruisers HMS Belfast and Sheffield, and the heavy cruiser HMS Norfolk. Force 2 was under Bruce Fraser's direct leadership. It was led by his massive flagship, Duke of York, supported by the heavy cruiser HMS Jamaica and the destroyers HMS Saumarez, Savage, Scorpion, and the Norwegian Stord. Then there was the 36th Destroyer Division accompanying convoy JW-55A, commanded by Commander Ralph Fisher, including an ocean escort of 7 destroyers led by HMS Onslow. Convoy JW-55B would be the bait. Forces 1 and 2 would need complete surprise to lure the Scharnhorst in close to the convoy before springing a deadly trap. Employing their advanced radar systems and ultra-intelligence, these impressive forces would work together to snare the German warship and destroy her once and for all. But British victory was not guaranteed. A single miscalculation could delay the heavy British units and spell disaster for the convoy. Scharnhorst and her supporting destroyers would be able to hunt freely and sink dozens of ships, bringing not only materiel and human losses, but also handing a resounding propaganda triumph to the Germans. Or, if Forces 1 and 2 were spotted before the trap could be sprung, Scharnhorst might slink away back to Norway and escape. Fraser was relying on his technological advantages, and central to it all was the accurate intelligence on whether Scharnhorst had indeed taken the bait and when she would sail. The mission was afoot, and the trap would be set. Now Fraser had to wait and see if the Germans would bite. The British were on a tight schedule, primarily due to fuel concerns for the escorting destroyers, a window of just 30 hours. Fraser was tasked with ensuring his sailing coincided perfectly with the convoy's most vulnerable point. Departing at 10 PM on December 23rd, Fraser's Force 2 travelled at 15 knots. They aimed for a position where they could react at the first possible sighting of the German ships. Meanwhile, Admiral Burnett's Force 1 had departed earlier. They had started out by escorting the convoy JW-55A, but their plan was to loop back for convoy 55B and then rendezvous with Fraser's forces. The strategic placement of these British ships, with varied fuel needs and originating from different ports, was intricate but well executed. Their concentration would peak as the convoy approached the Barents Sea near the U-boat bases, Luftwaffe airfields, and the Scharnhorst herself. Meanwhile, the Germans were already off to a bad start. In the Barents Sea, deteriorating weather conditions battered the U-boats of Operation Ostfront, preventing them from intercepting the convoy. They could see it, but frustratingly, an attack wasn't possible. A single-fired torpedo had missed. But while the U-boats relayed the convoy's location, the Germans lacked a clear picture of JW-55B's route. All the Wolfpack could do now was turn and follow the convoy. Nevertheless, the information from the U-boats proved valuable. On Scharnhorst, Bay was relying purely on exactly this kind of intelligence to plot his next move. As the U-boats followed them, he got a clearer picture of where they were going and began to formulate a battle plan. Aboard Duke of York, Admiral Fraser intended to position Force 2 advantageously close by, but JW-55B still remained vulnerable, particularly as bait for Scharnhorst. Their entire plan was nearly revealed when the Germans picked up a British radio signal. They thought it had come from a straggling convoy merchant ship, but it had actually originated from the massive battleship Duke of York. Had the German Air Force decided to investigate, they might have discovered Force 2's presence and Fraser's trap would be ruined. But they didn't. A straggler in a convoy was nothing to worry about, and the message went unheeded. On Christmas Day, while docked in Oltefjord, Scharnhorst began to prepare for her departure. Any remnants of the festive season, including Christmas decorations, were discarded overboard, later to be discovered by local Norwegians when they washed ashore. For both Admiral Bay and Admiral Fraser, timing was always of the essence. However, unforeseen delays set Admiral Bay back, and by 7 p.m. that day, Scharnhorst finally set sail for Operation Ostfront, already 2 hours behind schedule. She was accompanied by 5 destroyers, led by Kaptein Rolf Johansen aboard the Z-29. To regain the timetable, Admiral Bay directed Captain Hintze to push his ship's speed to 17 knots. But as they ventured into the Barents Sea shortly before 11 p.m. on Christmas Day, Scharnhorst's speed surged to 25 knots in the teeth of a raging gale. Taking a course nearly due north for the convoy, the gale, tailing the German force, made navigation challenging, especially for the top-heavy destroyers. Approaching Bear Island, with convoy JW-55B roughly 250 nautical miles ahead, Bay anticipated contact by 9:30 a.m. the next morning. That night, all the forces, Bay and the Germans, and the British forces, Fraser's Force 1 and 2, were zeroing in on convoy JW-55B under appalling weather conditions. The weather did not relent. The conditions were so severe that Captain Peters, head of the Norwegian U-boat force, voiced his concerns to Admiral Schneewind at Group North headquarters about the destroyer's abilities in such heavy seas. Peters believed Ostfront should be aborted, and Schneewind agreed. He sought cancellation approval from Grand Admiral Donitz, and at the same time, Bay reached out to Group North too, highlighting the challenges that his destroyers were facing in aiming their weapons in the turbulent weather. The response was not heartening. Donitz decided that the mission would have to proceed. A hesitant Bay was updated to stay the course. Equipped with the latest convoy position, Scharnhorst and the destroyer force battled through the seas to make their intercept. But while the U-boats pursued the convoy and maintained their contact and the massive German battleship surged onward, Bay remained completely unaware that he and his men were steaming into a British ambush. Early on the 26th, the dark early morning brought no real easing of the heavy seas. Bay checked with his destroyer commander, Captain Johansen aboard Z-29, about the destroyer's condition in the current weather, and Johansen assured him that if the wind remained favourable, they could press on. It was not easy going. The small warships struggled, decks awash through the heaving waves. Then the Germans finally got some good news. Johansen received a transmission from the submarine U-716 revealing that early information had been wrong, and the convoy was actually 30 nautical miles west of their previous estimate. This positioning actually set Scharnhorst up perfectly for an intercept. The delay in departing from Norway had initially seemed disadvantageous, but now it had worked in the Germans' favour. Capitalising on this, Bay intended to deploy his destroyers as scouts near the convoy's anticipated location. It would allow them to engage and tie down the convoy escorts until Scharnhorst could arrive on scene, move in, and destroy the convoy. It was a simple enough plan, and at last it seemed like Operation Ostfront might be a success. But the British were one step ahead. Around this time, Admiral Fraser on Duke of York was informed via ultra code breaking about the Germans' movements and their reactions to the bait. Convoy JW-55B, travelling at approximately just 6 knots due to the weather, was around 50 nautical miles south of Bear Island, moving northeast. Vice Admiral Burnett's Force 1 was roughly 150 nautical miles east of JW-55B, but was rapidly closing the gap. Fraser's Force 2 lagged by over 200 nautical miles, but was also swiftly catching up. Now this positioning suggested that Burnett would rendezvous with JW-55B before both Fraser and Scharnhorst, likely around 9 a.m. Now this timing was ideal for the British. Burnett could strategically position the cruiser Force 1 between the convoy and Scharnhorst, potentially obstructing Bay's path and buying enough time for Force 2 and the Duke of York to close in for the kill. Aboard Scharnhorst's bridge, as the ship rocked and rolled underfoot, Bay decided it was time to begin his intercept. He veered the German force slightly east to outpace its expected route. His chief concern was the storm, enabling JW-55B to elude him. By 5 a.m, Bay resumed a northward trajectory, anticipating an encounter with the convoy in the coming hours. Around this time, Captain Hintze sent his men to action stations. Bay enacted his plan. He deployed his destroyers to scout out about 10 nautical miles ahead to keep an eye out for the telltale smoke from the convoy. Now positioned, the fleet reduced speed to just 12 knots to better handle the weather. But then, Bay made a baffling decision. He redirected his entire battle group southwest, moving directly away from the convoy's predicted location. If he had persisted on the original course, his destroyers would have soon detected the convoy. With JW-55B only 30 nautical miles west of both Scharnhorst and the destroyers, the German destroyer screen continued searching ahead, likely thinking they'd bypassed the convoy. Their distance made visual signalling between the destroyers and Scharnhorst impossible. At around 8:30 in the morning, possibly rethinking his choice, Bay ordered Scharnhorst to turn northward. But, due to the distance, Johansson's destroyers remained unaware, and they kept their southwestern direction. It was a strange omission, but it would not be the last time that Bay would seem to forget about his destroyers. Given this unexpected course change, if Bay had relayed his decision and the destroyers repositioned north of the advancing Scharnhorst, the Germans could have found themselves strategically placed between the convoy and Force One, surprising the British and nearly ensuring an encounter with the convoy. But it wasn't to be. The blunder kept the Germans away from a successful intercept. Burnett's cruiser force, Force One, was now situated 20 nautical miles east, while JW-55B was about 20 nautical miles northwest. After 8 AM on December 26th, Burnett steered Force One northwest in the direction of the convoy. At the same time, Scharnhorst kept moving north, and the German destroyers, undeterred, still sailed southwest. Then, at 8:34 AM, HMS Norfolk detected a large, northward-moving target approximately 16 nautical miles away. Soon after that, the other cruisers identified the significant contact too. Burnett's anxiety stemmed from the realization that if this target was Scharnhorst, which seemed highly probable, it now lay between him and JW-55B and could potentially confront the convoy within the hour. His concerns were not unfounded. The contact was Scharnhorst. But then the Germans made another perplexing move. Upon detecting the German ships, HMS Belfast reported that the contact had veered southeast. By 8:50 AM, Scharnhorst had shifted direction. She was now trailing her destroyers. Bay was probably searching for the convoy. Surely they should be in sight by now. The destroyers had got far away, and he couldn't communicate with them. Where was everyone? Well, unbeknownst to Bay, he was inadvertently distancing himself from the convoy, and Force One was now stealthily tailing him. The Germans had taken the bait and fallen into the first part of the trap, all the while missing the convoy. Force One maintained its pursuit, strategically positioning itself to intercept. At 9:21 AM, the imposing silhouette of Scharnhorst emerged from the darkness at a mere distance of 13,000 yards or 11.8 kilometers away from Force One. Belfast promptly launched a star shell high into the air, which, like a flare, illuminated the German battleship. The British were ready for the fight, and the Germans were not. Scharnhorst's crew, caught completely off guard, hadn't employed their radar for fear of revealing her location. If it was active, they might have detected the approaching British forces. British onlookers observed that while Scharnhorst's turrets remained trained uselessly fore and aft, their own weapons were primed and ready. They had the element of surprise, and Scharnhorst had been caught alone. Acting swiftly, Bay commanded a southeastern turn, while the British continued northwest, but just minutes later, HMS Norfolk, with an unobstructed view due to Bay's manoeuvre, fired her 8-inch guns from about 10,000 yards away. They were the first shots of the battle, but even then, Norfolk's first salvo managed to strike Scharnhorst, killing one and injuring several others. But the hits had dealt a devastating blow to Scharnhorst already. Her forward radar, already inferior to that of the British but crucial in engaging warships in this kind of harsh weather, was knocked out. Scharnhorst turned south to slip away, making full steam, and although the British cruisers fired on, Scharnhorst did not fire back. The British halted their offensive by 9:38 AM as Scharnhorst sailed away at full speed, and Burnett's Force One followed her from afar. With Scharnhorst now heading southeast at a swift 24 knots, and Force One strategically positioned between her and the convoy, the British now held the upper hand. Burnett hoped he could tail the German warship until Force 2 could arrive, but Scharnhorst's speed far surpassed the British cruisers, which struggled to maintain 16 knots through the punishing waves. By 10 AM, Scharnhorst had vanished from the British cruisers' radar. Burnett now had a choice to make: to keep up the chase or head back to protect the convoy. He was concerned that Scharnhorst would make a second try, and now, with his cruisers outpaced, he had no hope of catching the German battleship. Protecting JW-55B was Burnett's top priority. He ordered the cruiser force to head back and protect it. On Scharnhorst Bridge, Bay grappled with what had just happened. He had anticipated only a meagre British destroyer escort, and the presence of larger vessels caught him completely off guard. Although he strongly suspected he'd faced cruisers, the enveloping darkness left room for doubt about the exact size of his adversary. Bay then contacted Johansen and the destroyer force by radio and realised that there was a significant distance separating them from each other. They were now heading in opposite directions. Puzzlingly, Bay delayed recalling them, allowing the gap between them to expand to over 40 nautical miles before finally ordering them to return. Now, the distance made the German destroyer's support highly improbable. Then, Bay received a report from U-277, claiming that the convoy was spotted moving east around 9:30 AM. Now, this report was incorrect. In reality, the U-boat had observed Commander Fisher's destroyers en route to join Force 1, while the convoy shifted northward. Bay decided he'd have another crack at the convoy. He deduced that the cruisers that he had just encountered were shielding the convoy, and thought that the merchant ships now lay northwest of his position. He remained optimistic about bypassing the cruisers on his next attempt to converge with the convoy, and set a course for a second attempt at an intercept. By 10:30 AM, Fraser and Force 2 were still at a considerable distance away, patiently awaiting more intelligence. While Scharnhorst's exact location was unknown, Fraser had fortified Force 1 with 4 destroyers from the convoy, and then redirected JW-55B northward. Fisher's destroyers, having joined Force 1 shortly before 10:30 AM, were positioned in the vanguard to screen the cruisers. Burnett detected the convoy moving northward on his radar, strategically placing him to intercept Scharnhorst's potential approach if she tried again. Fraser's tactics ensured that his forces would be between the Scharnhorst and the convoy come what may, and that the heavy Force 2 would be able to knock the Scharnhorst out. But then, his cover was suddenly blown. At around 1:40 PM on the 26th, a trio of German flying boats spotted Fraser's fleet and relayed this information to Captain Peters in Narvik, intended for Admiral Schneewind at Group North in Kiel. The Germans figured that this British fleet was a distant screen for the convoy, possibly containing a battleship. Fraser had hoped that the presence of Force 2 would remain a secret. It was intended to be the knockout blow that would kill Scharnhorst, but now the Germans had seen them. It should have been the end. News of a heavier British presence might have persuaded Bay to disengage, but then the Germans made another mistake. This crucial intelligence wasn't communicated to Bay for hours to come, allowing Force 2 to inch even closer undetected. By noon, Bay sensed that the convoy was near and altered his course from north to southwest. He also directed Johansen and the destroyer force to a specified rendezvous point to reach by 12:20 PM. This meeting spot would situate the destroyers approximately 20 nautical miles southwest of Scharnhorst, offering a chance for a unified assault on the convoy. This time, Bay was adamant the convoy would not get away, and the Germans would be able to inflict some serious damage. Just after noon, HMS Belfast again detected a radar contact to the northeast, approximately 13 nautical miles away. This blip was swiftly identified by both Sheffield and Norfolk and the 4 destroyers. It could only be Scharnhorst moving in for a second try. As the distance between the ships narrowed over the subsequent quarter hour, Burnett strategically positioned his fleet to ensure unobstructed firing lines, and then, at 12:21 PM, he commanded a star shell be launched, and for the second time that day, Scharnhorst was fully illuminated and caught completely unprepared. With less than 6 nautical miles separating them, Burnett directed his ships to commence firing. The oceans roared around them, and Scharnhorst's crew desperately rushed to swing their main gun turrets around to meet the threat, but it was again the British who had the essence of surprise. Despite the tumultuous seas, the British assault was remarkably accurate. Both Norfolk and Sheffield registered hits, and only 10 miles away, sailors aboard ships in convoy JW-55B could see the muzzle flashes lighting up the dark sky. Scharnhorst, however, wasn't destined to sit idly by and be fired at without response. As the gap between the adversaries shortened to about 2 nautical miles, she finally retaliated with a barrage of 11-inch shells, inflicting significant splinter damage on Sheffield. Although Norfolk was the intended target, Scharnhorst recalibrated her aim by 12:37 PM, delivered deadly blows to Norfolk, knocking out one of her turrets and causing casualties. Another shell penetrated deeper, igniting fires within the ship. The Germans had drawn blood. Scharnhorst successfully found the range, but at such a close distance it was hardly a challenge. Bay had instructed Captain Hintzer to accelerate to 28 knots, allowing Scharnhorst to distance herself from Burnett's fleet and disengage once again. By 12:40 PM, the gap had widened to almost 7 miles. But amidst the challenging weather and choppy seas, accurate firing became increasingly difficult for both sides. Fisher's destroyers initially intended to launch a torpedo assault, but they had to abandon their plans because the Scharnhorst was now quickly outpacing them. Burnett signalled a ceasefire at 12:41 PM, concluding an intense, albeit brief, 20-minute skirmish. After this second clash, Bay reassessed his situation. He had been ambushed twice, and on both occasions he had to retreat swiftly. While he had inflicted damage on both Sheffield and Norfolk, Scharnhorst hadn't emerged unscathed. Recognising his compromised position and noting his crew's exhaustion, Bay doubted the feasibility of another attempt on the convoy. He wanted to turn his ship for home, so he radioed back to Narvik, exaggerating his encounter with, quote, several heavy units with radar-guided fire. Although he was aware that he'd only faced cruisers, he hoped that this would justify his return. By 1 PM, Bay directed Scharnhorst southeast towards the familiar fjords of Norway. In his view, Operation Ostfront was over. Spoiled by superior British radar and poor weather, he steamed away, bound for the North Cape of Norway. The last time this had happened, Scharnhorst had got away and Burnett had decided to return to the convoy, but this time, things were different. Burnett was confident the Germans had abandoned their attack on the convoy, now he opted to pursue. Miraculously now, his ships could actually match Scharnhorst's 28-knot pace and keep her within their radar range. Fisher initially doubted his destroyer's ability to keep up, but he was pleasantly surprised when they could. With the wind at their backs, it wasn't easy, but it was possible to keep up with the German warship. Bay's decision not to turn southwest into the gale proved crucial. If he had done so, Burnett would have had to reduce his speed, allowing Scharnhorst an escape. But instead, he turned directly for Norway, not realising that he was actually being followed by Force 1. By 1:30 PM, Luftwaffe intelligence finally informed Bay of Force 2's presence, and it was not welcome news. In continuous communication with Burnett, Fraser knew Scharnhorst's precise location, and he steered east to intercept her route to Oltjefjord. Conversely, Bay had only a vague notion of where this apparent formidable fleet might be. Remarkably, Bay seemed to have again forgotten his destroyers. Having reached the rendezvous point around 12:20 PM, Johansson's destroyer force, positioned in a search line, neared the convoy around 1 PM, but they didn't detect it. Only 8 nautical miles separated them, making it a harrowingly close encounter. By 1:40 PM, they were significantly distant from Scharnhorst. Finally remembering his destroyers, Bay directed them towards Norway by 2:30 PM, hoping that they would all reach safety the following day. As the destroyers set course for home, Scharnhorst's captain Hintzer informed his crew that their mission was aborted and they'd be returning to Norway. But unbeknownst to all, they were being tailed, and Admiral Fraser's trap was about to spring shut. Around 2:30 PM, Scharnhorst veered south, and Fraser deducted that the ship was effectively cornered, alerting his officers to anticipate action by 4:30 PM, and his estimate was remarkably accurate. At 4:17 PM on December 26, 1943, HMS Duke of York's radar detected a target 23 nautical miles away to the northeast. It was, of course, Scharnhorst. With Forces 1 and 2 closing in, Fraser realised the Germans would soon be within the firing range of Duke of York's formidable 14-inch guns, precisely at the time that he had anticipated. This positioning also allowed the British to cross the T of the Germans, a tactical advantage where they could unleash their full broadside while the German ship would only be limited to its forward weaponry. This bleak stretch of ocean was set to become a killing field. Aboard Duke of York, gunners refined their aim, ensuring the radar-guided 14-inch weapons stood ready to strike. Ahead of the battleship, destroyers assumed positions ideal for a subsequent torpedo assault. Following closely behind the flagship was the cruiser HMS Jamaica. And soon after, radar aboard Duke of York detected Force 1 converging for the intercept. Nearing 4:45 PM, Scharnhorst surged southward at full speed. They were coming closer and closer into range with no idea what was about to hit them. And then it happened. At around 4:47 PM, from just over 6 nautical miles or 11 kilometers away, Duke of York launched star shells high into the sky. Caught off guard for the third and final time, Bay and Scharnhorst's crew were suddenly exposed under the stark white light of the star shells. Duke of York already had the German ship's range and speed calculated with perfect accuracy. They got to their deadly work. Deafening roar, the 14-inch guns spewed hellfire and shells weighing as much as small cars smashed home. Scharnhorst's crew were just reeling under the shock of this sudden danger when the first shells landed, bursting clean through steel and armour to detonate inside with horrifying results. Scharnhorst's forward main gun turret was hit and almost immediately incapacitated, with most of its crew killed. As Duke of York fired on, the cruiser Jamaica got to work too, the shells straddling the German ship and sending up great gouts of water. Scharnhorst's crew had been caught unprepared, but now they finally responded. At 4:53 PM, the ship's 2 remaining main turrets fired furiously back, their smaller 11-inch shells surging through the air to straddle Duke of York. It was a near miss, but the first salvo damaged the British flagship with splinters and knocked out the delicate search radar. Duke of York answered this indignity with salvo after salvo of devastating fire. This was exactly the kind of action Scharnhorst had been designed to evade, and now the ship had been caught out in a killing field surrounded by powerful enemies, but things were only getting worse. Out of the darkness came Force 1, which had tailed the Germans since the earlier engagement. HMS Belfast opened fire at 4:59, followed quickly by Norfolk. But Scharnhorst answered back, and her artillery proved accurate. She engaged the 2 cruisers from Force 1 with her smaller secondary battery. The German ship's manoeuvres increased her distance from Force 2, effectively drawing her parallel to Force 1. With only her aft turret engaging Duke of York, Scharnhorst faced attacks from 2 fronts. Bay urgently radioed to Group North they were being engaged by a heavy battleship, a somewhat understated scenario because in reality, Scharnhorst was under assault from a battleship, 3 cruisers and several destroyers. Amidst the fray, 2 of Fraser's destroyers ventured so close to Scharnhorst that they retreated to evade friendly fire. By 5:15 PM, as the distance between Scharnhorst, Force 1 and Force 2 was growing, Fraser commanded his 4 destroyers to prepare for torpedo strikes, but the increasing gap, paired with Scharnhorst's high speed, hindered their approach, and they couldn't get into an effective firing position. For the moment, the main combatants would remain the larger vessels. The guns roared on, and now, obscured from view, Duke of York relied on her radar-guided weaponry. The skirmish lasted for another 30 minutes, while Scharnhorst widened the gap. By 5:45 PM, with the German ship outpacing its pursuers, Jamaica ceased firing due to the range, followed shortly by the cruisers from Force 1. Although Duke of York's radar had an effective range of about 15 nautical miles, the absence of visual contact made accuracy challenging. As Scharnhorst manoeuvred to disrupt Duke of York's targeting, both ships resorted to blind firing in the deepening darkness. By 6 PM, with Scharnhorst significantly ahead and the radar on Duke of York no longer effective at that range, both battleships blindly engaged one another, firing in the direction of the muzzle flashes that they could see. Fraser realised that Scharnhorst was on the verge of getting away, but fate had a different plan. At about 6:20 PM, Duke of York landed 2 nearly impossible hits on Scharnhorst. While the initial shell, which pierced the area just forward of the bridge, killed several men, but otherwise inflicted minimal damage, the subsequent shell proved catastrophic. This burst ruptured steam lines and compromised boilers, reducing Scharnhorst's speed from 28 to 22 knots immediately, and then it continued to drop. Eventually the speed settled at 20, still far too slow to outrun the British. The implications were clear to Bay. If his ship speed wasn't restored, the British would close in. It took a while for Fraser and the Duke of York to figure out that his enemy was suffering problems. It appeared to the British in that moment that they'd been unsuccessful in bringing the Scharnhorst to heel. But then, soon after, the functioning radar sets aboard Duke of York indicated the range to the German ship was actually decreasing. The British were gaining, and Fraser could clearly see it with his own eyes. Scharnhorst's prize speed advantage was gone, and the British were now in with a chance. As Duke of York and Jamaica started narrowing the gap, they remained beyond visual range of the German battleship. To the northwest, Burnett and Force One were also making ground. Burnett detached his 4 destroyers, ordering them into position to ambush Scharnhorst with torpedoes, and at the same time Fraser had ordered his 4 destroyers to move in as well, and they would arrive first. As they discreetly closed the gap to within 4 miles, Scharnhorst detected the threat. An 11-inch shell hit Saumarez but didn't detonate. Instead, it passed straight through the ship. 3 torpedoes connected with Scharnhorst's starboard side. It was a devastating blow. The resulting flooding crippled the German battleship and reduced her speed to just 10 knots. She would now completely be at the mercy of the heavier British warships that were steaming straight for her. The British destroyers pulled back and out of the fray because now, with the German ship virtually crippled, the job of finishing her off was left to Duke of York. Just after 7 PM, having repaired her fire control radar, the British battleship turned to unmask her aft turret. Duke of York unleashed a relentless assault on Scharnhorst from just 6 nautical miles away, or effectively point-blank range. Over the next 30 minutes, Duke of York rained destruction on the German vessel, launching salvos every 45 seconds to a minute. Many found their target. At such close range, it would be almost impossible to miss. Jamaica, with her 6-inch guns, and Belfast, having closed the gap by 7:15, joined the bombardment. Although Duke of York's 14-inch shells largely couldn't breach Scharnhorst's armoured belt, they devastated her superstructure, inflicting heavy casualties. Scharnhorst was being demolished from the top down. As Duke of York drew nearer, Scharnhorst retaliated once she came into visual range. However, with her forward 11-inch turret destroyed and her second 11-inch turret firing only under local control, she could only answer lamely. The second turret was knocked out itself at 7:20 PM, and now Scharnhorst could only rely on her aft, final turret to answer the murderous British fire. 10 minutes later, those guns fell silent too after exhausting their ammunition supply. The defence was left to the small 150mm secondary guns, but with fire control destroyed, and cruiser and battleship caliber shells raining down around them, they were of little use. The German commanders had known for some time that the game was up. Captain Hintze had once dreamt of commanding a heavy warship of Scharnhorst's caliber. Now she was being shot out from underneath him. His 7:20 PM message to Group North resonated with desperation and defiance. "We shall fight to the last shell. Long live Germany. Long live the Führer." By this time, Scharnhorst, which was damaged, burning, and listing to starboard, traced a slow, wide circle. The ship was a flaming wreck, but a wreck that remained afloat. The British would not be content to let Scharnhorst remain. They were avenging hundreds of merchant ships sunk, and their brothers who'd been aboard ships like Glorious and Rawalpindi, lost to German guns in the brutal battle for the Atlantic. Fraser observed the beleaguered Scharnhorst, her superstructure battered and her formidable guns rendered useless, and he saw an opportunity to deliver the final blow. Just before 7:20, he instructed the cruiser Jamaica to advance and launch a torpedo strike. As Jamaica moved into position, Duke of York held her fire, providing the cruiser a clear path. Belfast, which had closed the range, began a torpedo run of her own. Fisher, leading 4 destroyers from Force 1, also steered his flotilla towards the beleaguered battleship to make his run after the cruisers had made theirs. It was a turkey shoot, more like putting down a mortally wounded animal than anything else. In a meticulously coordinated attack, Jamaica neared Scharnhorst's starboard side to a mere 1.5 miles distance and launched 2 torpedoes shortly before 7:30. But almost immediately after, Belfast unleashed 3 more torpedoes from a slightly greater distance. But Scharnhorst, despite her condition, wasn't finished yet because, remarkably, Hintze managed to evade all 5 torpedoes, showcasing the battleship's nimbleness and Hintze's skill, even in spite of his ship's badly compromised state. But tragically, the onslaught was far from over. As those torpedoes sped past Scharnhorst, Commander Fisher's destroyers entered the fray, and just after 7:30 PM, HMS Opportune launched 2 torpedoes from a mere mile away, both, of course, finding their mark in Scharnhorst's flank. The others followed suit, releasing 7 torpedoes, 2 of which struck the battleship. Within this brief but intense window, Scharnhorst sustained 4 torpedo impacts on her starboard side, and soon after, HMS Musketeer unleashed 4 more, claiming 2 more hits on Scharnhorst's port side. The end had at last come. With his vessel burning and flooding, at 7:40 PM, Captain Hintze relayed the somber order to abandon ship. But for many of Scharnhorst's crew, escape was a fantasy. The ship's rapid sinking in the icy waters consumed many. As Scharnhorst rolled onto her starboard side, her propellers still turning, she began her descent into the abyss. But below decks, countless sailors found themselves entombed, their escape routes cut off. For the few who braved the exterior, the Arctic's merciless embrace awaited them. As hypothermia rapidly took hold, swimming became a Herculean feat of its own, with only the occasional life raft or piece of flotsam offering a fleeting hope of reprieve. Only a handful of her crew managed to flee the ship and evade the powerful suction as she sank. The once mighty battleship, along with most of her crew, vanished beneath the freezing, churning waves, and it was over. Scharnhorst, the lucky ship, was gone. The British destroyers scoured the scene for survivors and were met with a haunting spectacle. An expanse of oil-slicked waters, strewn with wreckage and lifeless bodies. The only remnant of the once majestic Scharnhorst was the 36 shivering survivors that they plucked from the chilling grip of the Barents Sea. Notably missing among them were Konter-Admiral Bay and Captain Hintze. Given the frigid conditions, survival beyond 10 minutes was improbable. Fraser's succinct message to the Admiralty in London was clear. Scharnhorst sunk. The response was equally crisp. Grand. Well done. A classic example of British understatement. No crew of a fighting warship are happy to see their sailor brethren, even their enemies, subjected to the horrors of a sinking. Fraser spoke with his officers later and said, "Gentlemen, the battle against Scharnhorst has ended in victory for us. I hope that if any of you are ever called upon to lead a ship into action against an opponent many times superior, you will command your ship as gallantly as Scharnhorst was commanded today." Estimating the German casualties aboard Scharnhorst presents challenges. A conservative count suggests at least 1,930 men perished, while other estimates inch closer to 2,030. We'll never know the true toll. The fall of Scharnhorst signalled a pivotal shift in the north. With Tirpitz sidelined, the convoy route saw the demise of their last formidable surface threats. Outmanoeuvred by a superior adversary, Scharnhorst's fate was sealed not just by British tactical expertise, but also by their superior intelligence, weaponry, and notably, advanced radar. The odds, compounded by overwhelming British numbers, rendered Operation Ostfront's outcome nearly inevitable. Still, Scharnhorst's valiant resistance echoed the resilient stand of the Bismarck, both ultimately outmatched by the Royal Navy's might. Convoy JW-55B proceeded safely to the Soviet Union, reaching its destination on December 29th. The triumphant British vessels returned to a hero's welcome, their achievements resonating globally. Praises for Admiral Fraser flowed in from luminaries such as Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin. It was a defining victory. But Germany was confronted with the grim news of the lucky Scharnhorst on the same day, December 29th. Grand Admiral Dönitz, who had fervently championed the mission, blamed Bay for the debacle. It was easy, because Bay wasn't alive to defend himself. The cards were stacked against him from the outset. The might of the British forces left him outplayed. Speculation remains rife about the outcome had the Duke of York not landed that fateful, blind shot in the Arctic darkness. It had effectively sealed Scharnhorst's fate. The world may never truly know, but it's likely she would have escaped. And just like Bismarck before her, the fate of Scharnhorst had come down to a lucky hit. Regardless, Scharnhorst and the lives of her valiant crew had been simply thrown away on a mission that had been doomed from the start. It was a sad end to what had once been the German Navy's lucky ship, and today she rests on the floor of the Barents Sea, a tomb for the hundreds of men who never made it out.